Everything you think is impossible. Alexander the Great already proved it can be broken. You might even think that some walls are unreachable, that certain obstacles were made to keep you stuck. But what if I told you that a 22-year-old, without modern technology, without Google Maps, and without excuses, faced the most fortified city of the ancient world, and won? Yes, he won. And it wasn't just with a sword. It was with vision, courage, and an idea that, at the time, seemed like pure madness, to build a road over the sea in the middle of a naval siege. Who would do that? Alexander. Only him, a man who didn't know the meaning of limit and made a point of showing the world, shot by shot. This video will reveal to you how the most unlikely victory of antiquity became a lesson in strategy, persistence, and boldness. A real treasure map for anyone seeking to win battles that seem impossible, whether on the battlefield or in life. So, if you've ever felt like the world told you no, that your dreams are too big, or that no one believes in you, this video is for you, because the story of the siege of Tyre isn't just about Alexander. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept the impossible. If there's one thing Alexander knew how to do, besides taking a perfect shot at the maps of power, it was to see beyond the walls. Tyre wasn't just a pretty little island in the middle of the sea. It was a rich fortress, surrounded by gigantic walls and with a respectable navy. The kind of place that, if controlled, would make even the gods turn their faces. Taking Tyre was like cutting the Persian Empire's naval legs off, a clean, no-nonsense strike. The city of Tyre was practically a floating safe hidden in the sea, but Alexander the Great wasn't the type to back down from a safe with no key. On the contrary, the more impossible the challenge, the sharper his focus became. Tyre was Persia's last hope in the Mediterranean, the key to cutting off the enemy's supply line and to transforming the empire into a giant without oxygen. And Alexander, he was already honing the shot he was about to take. By dominating Tyre, he wouldn't only control the coast, he would bury any attempt at naval resistance once and for all. Imagine the audacity. A young Macedonian king going up against the best-positioned forces in the region, all to ensure that no one would ever dare challenge his name again. And it wasn't just a thirst for conquest. It was pure, refined strategy from someone who understood the game like no one else. Alexander the Great knew that to win Tyre was to win the sea, but the charm of the city was also its trap. Isolated, fortified, confident, almost arrogant. The Phoenicians, owners of the city, believed they had the advantage. They bet big, thinking Alexander would just stand there frustrated on the beach. Little did they know, they were messing with someone who didn't know the word quit. Because once Alexander's Tyre was set in motion, there was no turning back. And that's precisely when things started to heat up for real. Because if Tyre thought that saying no was enough to stop Alexander the Great, they were gravely mistaken. It was at that moment that everything changed. When Alexander arrived with his retinue and asked to enter Tyre to perform a simple sacrifice in the temple, he expected to hear a "Yes, Your Majesty." But he received a no, as dry as the desert wind. And it wasn't just any no, it was a direct message. You may have toppled half the world, but here you don't step. Tyre, once again, made it clear that it wasn't easy to cross. For Alexander the Great, that was more than a refusal. It was an affront. He didn't want to just get in for the sake of it. It was a political move, a symbolic gesture of dominance. By denying his request, the Tyrians were basically saying, "You're not in charge here, and between you and me," provoking Alexander was like poking a lion with an arrow. It wasn't going to end well. The inhabitants of Tyre thought they were on top. They had the sea as their wall, ships as their shield, and geography as their advantage. They believed he would turn back, keep Tyre holstered, and look for another fight. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Alexander the Great wasn't one to accept no as an answer, especially when it was wrapped in pride. It became a matter of honor, but not the dramatic soap opera kind. It was strategic honor, the kind that stirs the warrior's soul. Alexander wanted more than just to conquer a city. He wanted to show that no one challenges his authority and gets away with it. Tyre's refusal ignited in him a fire that not even the waters of the Mediterranean could put out. And it was in that fire that one of the boldest decisions of antiquity was born. Because if the Tyrians thought they were protected by being surrounded by water, Alexander was already scheming on how to turn the sea into solid ground. If there's one thing that separates the ordinary from the legendary, it's the ability to look at a gigantic problem and think, what if? Well, Alexander looked at the sea that separated the island of Tyre from the mainland and decided on something that, to most, would sound like madness. He was going to build a road in the middle of the sea. That's right, a bridge made of stone, wood, and stubbornness. The kind of shot only someone with an imperial vision could take. The idea was simple on paper, but maddening in execution. Half a kilometer of sea, full of strong currents, against time, against attacks, and against logic. But Alexander the Great had a brutal advantage. He didn't play with fear, he played with faith. The faith that if he challenged the limits would have to give in. It was more than a strategy. It was a war cry against impossibility. And so the work of turning water into land began, literally. Stones were piled up, wood was driven in, and men marched over the impossible as if it were routine. With every meter gained, Alexander not only edged closer to Tyre's walls, but also proved to the world that those who dare succeed. It wasn't just engineering, it was psychology. It was a message. If I can do this, I can take anything. Of course, there were those who doubted. There always are. The cynics laughed, the enemies mocked, and even some allies furrowed their brows. But Alexander was the type of man who, when he set his sights on a goal, could see victory even before taking the first step. Tyre was already set in motion. It was only a matter of time before he hit the target, and while the bridge grew like a serpent of stones toward the island, the Tyrians finally began to understand that this siege was no ordinary affair. Alexander wasn't just pounding on the door, he was building the way to break down the gate. The Tyrians weren't just going to sit back and watch as Alexander turned the sea into a walkway to victory. They fought back, and fiercely. They sent divers to dismantle what they could underwater, launched burning ships directly against the bridge's structures, and turned the sea into an ambush field. It was a true ballet of Tyre and fire, set to a score of smoke, tension, and the courage of both sides. Every day was a different battle. Alexander tried to build, the Tyrians tried to destroy. It was like constructing a house of cards in the middle of a storm. But Alexander the Great wasn't made of paper. He began to realize that to win this war, it wasn't enough to have your feet on solid ground. You also had to have eyes and strength on the sea. That's when he changed strategy. He gathered boats from the ports he had already conquered, from Sidon, from Aradus, from Byblos, and began forming his own fleet. Instead of relying solely on land construction, he decided to fight the Tyrians in the very element they controlled. The game changed. Now, Alexander's Tyre was coming not just from above, but from all sides. And look, it was a spectacle of adaptation. Alexander blocked routes, surrounded ships, and created points of attack and defense right in the sea. The bridge, once vulnerable, now had protection. And with each frustrated attempt by the Tyrians, Alexander's confidence grew. The impossible no longer seemed so far away. On the contrary, he was getting closer to turning that challenge into a monument, but the final blow was still missing. The bridge advanced, the fleet grew, yet Tyre still stood defending itself with everything it had. The siege was tightening, and Alexander knew it was time to elevate the game. And, as always, he had a trump card up his sleeve that no one expected. What came next would have even the gods dropping their jaws. With the calm of someone setting up a checkmate, Alexander initiated a war choreography like few had ever seen. The bridge now served as a base for giant siege towers, true mobile monsters of wood and metal. It was Tyre upon Tyre. While the Phoenicians expected a predictable offensive, Alexander delivered a spectacle of engineering. The towers came equipped with everything: archers on top, rotating shields, and even battering rams at the base. When they advanced, they looked like moving mountains. And the most fascinating part, everything was coordinated with simultaneous naval attacks. Imagine, while soldiers pushed the towers on solid ground, ships circled the city with catapults and more floating battering rams. It was an orchestra of destruction. No one there was improvising. Alexander the Great commanded like a relentless maestro, synchronizing every step, every arrow, every strike. Tyre, once so secure on its island, now found itself cornered in a strategic nightmare. The walls trembled, the Tyrians grew weary, and the pressure increased like a high tide on a stormy night. The enemy was surrounded, and they knew it, and even with the walls defending with everything they had, Alexander did not back down. If one tower caught fire, he had another built. If part of the fleet was sunk, he reinforced with more ships. It wasn't just brute force, it was persistence. He knew the siege wasn't only physical, it was mental. He was breaking Tyre's spirit, shot by shot, hammering it down blow by blow. And so, with every meticulously calculated move, Alexander tightened the noose around the city. The days were numbered, the walls might resist, but for how long? The moment every siege awaits arrived, the crash of the wall giving way. After months of sweat, strategy, and persistent shots, a breach was finally opened. It was like tearing Tyre's heart in half. Alexander didn't hesitate. He unleashed his men with the fury of someone carrying every drop of offense they had received since that very first no from that insolent city. What followed was brutal. The fighting inside the city was house to house, street by street, blood by blood. The Tyrians, cornered, resisted as best they could, but chaos was inevitable. Alexander the Great had entered, and now no one set the rules. Revenge wasn't coming solely from the sword. It was in the lesson he wanted the whole world to see. Thousands were killed. Many more were sold as slaves. Alexander showed no mercy, not because he was cruel, but because he was teaching, showing that challenging the shot of an empire has consequences. Every wall toppled, every scream heard, was a reminder carved in stone. With Alexander, you either align or get trampled. And he trampled. Some say it was overkill, others say it was justice. But one thing is for sure, that day was etched into the memory of history. The city that thought it was untouchable became a symbol of ruin, a reminder that even the strongest can fall when they underestimate someone with a giant dream, a map in hand, and the courage to pull the trigger. And while the flames still consumed the last remnants of resistance, Alexander looked ahead. Because Tyre had fallen, but what it represented was only beginning to spread across the world. What Alexander left in Tyre was more than a conquered city. It was a message that transcended generations. A young king, just over 20, looked at the impossible and said, "I'm going all the way." And he did. Not with empty boasts, but with strategy, vision, and an almost divine stubbornness. That wasn't just a conquest, it was the signature of an empire. The story of the siege became legend, and it's no wonder. Who else would have the audacity to turn the sea into land, challenge an entire island, and still emerge victorious? Alexander the Great showed that the walls of the world, no matter how high they seem, are fragile in the face of unyielding will. The shot he took there wasn't confined to Tyre. It echoed through every city that thought about resisting. This victory also changed the way war was thought about. It was the beginning of a new era in military engineering, of hybrid strategy, of attacks coming from where you least expected them. Alexander redefined the game, mixing intelligence with brutality, patience with explosive action. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was an architect of ambition and more. Tyre became a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to accept imposed limits. Even today, leaders, strategists, entrepreneurs all look at this story as a manual for courage, a lesson on how to deal with refusals, obstacles, and closed doors. Because deep down, everyone's Tyre is there, waiting for someone brave enough to cross it. But look, if you think this was impressive, just wait until you see how it all began. Because before the first step, before the first stone was thrown into the sea, there was something much more powerful pulsing within Alexander. Now tell me, what's your Tyre? What is that wall you swore was unreachable? That situation that seems impossible to overcome, but in truth only needs one bold decision, one that becomes the key to history? If Alexander the Great could turn the sea into a pathway, what's stopping you from turning your own challenges into epic victories? Are you going to stand still waiting for perfect conditions, or will you start building your bridge right now, even if everyone says it won't? Work, if this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications, and come with us to learn more about the minds and battles that shaped the world, and that still have so much to teach about courage, strategy, and leadership. Your empire begins with one step, and that step can be now.